In June 1934, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt placed Joseph Kennedy, a Wall Street speculator, in charge of policing the securities market. Within one generation, Kennedy money, political organization, and family discipline would help carry his son John into the White House. But the dynasty's greatest triumph was followed by 2 assassinations, a fatal scandal, and losses Americans came to call a curse. Was Kennedy tragedy simply fate, or was it entangled with the way the family pursued power? If you love learning about the rise and fall of powerful families, subscribe for more documentaries. In 1849, Patrick Kennedy was making barrels in a Boston cooperage. He had left Dunganstown in County Wexford during the devastation of the Great Famine, joining thousands of Irish people who crossed the Atlantic in search of work. That same year, he married another Irish immigrant, Bridget Murphy. Their beginning in America was modest, and it was brief. Their first son died of cholera. In 1858, Patrick died from the same disease, leaving Bridget with 4 surviving children and almost no protection against poverty. The family had survived the voyage, but survival in Boston remained uncertain. Bridget did more than endure. She acquired a small stationery and notions business, then expanded into a grocery store that gave the family a measure of stability. Her only surviving son, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, was born shortly before his father died. Bridget managed to send him to a private Catholic school, but he left formal education as a teenager and worked as a stevedore on Boston's waterfront. The distance between that job and national politics seemed enormous. Patrick Joseph began closing it through business. During the 1880s, he acquired a struggling saloon in East Boston. When it succeeded, he invested in additional establishments and entered liquor distribution. Saloons in immigrant neighborhoods were more than places to drink. They were centers of information, employment, credit, and political organization. Patrick Joseph developed a reputation for helping residents find work or temporary financial assistance. Those relationships created loyalty, and loyalty could be converted into votes. This was the operating system of ward politics. A ward was a local electoral district, and its boss connected residents to city services and patronage while expecting political support in return. The system could be generous, transactional, and exclusionary at the same time. It flourished partly because Irish Catholics often encountered discrimination from Boston's established Protestant elite. In 1886, Patrick Joseph won election to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He later served in the state Senate and remained an influential leader in East Boston's Ward 2 for decades. The Kennedy Network was not the only Irish political force in the city. John Francis Fitzgerald, widely known as Honey Fitz, built his own following through the Democratic Party. A gifted campaigner and former congressman, Fitzgerald served 2 non-consecutive periods as mayor of Boston. His daughter, Rose Fitzgerald, grew up close to political ceremony, public attention, and the obligations imposed on a prominent Catholic family. Patrick Joseph's son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, belonged to a different generation. Born in 1888, he enjoyed opportunities created by his grandmother's business and his father's political success. He attended Boston Latin School and Harvard University, institutions that placed him nearer to the Protestant establishment without entirely dissolving the social boundaries around Irish Catholics. After graduating, he became an assistant state bank examiner. At 25, he gained control of the troubled Columbia Trust Company and became its president. On October 7, 1914, Joseph married Rose Fitzgerald. The marriage joined 2 forms of influence. The Fitzgerald family contributed electoral experience, public recognition, and connections across Democratic politics. The Kennedys contributed a growing financial base and the disciplined ambition of Joseph, who viewed money less as a final achievement than as a means of independence and access. Together, Joseph and Rose would have 9 children, raised with the expectation that privilege created duties as well as opportunities. Joseph continued moving wherever capital and connections offered an opening. During World War I, he became assistant general manager at the Four River Shipyard in Quincy, where wartime production gave him experience managing a large industrial operation. He returned to finance, traded securities, established his own investment business, and accumulated substantial wealth before entering the film industry. In 1926, he acquired Film Booking Offices of America and imposed financial discipline on a business known for unstable accounting. His deals helped create Radio Keith Orpheum, and he withdrew from most of his Hollywood holdings with a large and relatively liquid fortune. Kennedy also sold much of his stock before the market crash of 1929. During the Depression, he invested in property and other ventures from a position of unusual strength. In 1933, anticipating the end of Prohibition, he secured American import rights for major British liquor brands. The business was legal once repeal took effect. Later stories portrayed him as a Prohibition bootlegger, but surviving evidence has not substantiated that accusation. His wealth was already established through banking, securities, shipbuilding, motion pictures, and real estate. By the early 1930s, 3 generations had transformed the Kennedy position. Bridget supplied survival and commercial stability. Patrick Joseph turned neighborhood relationships into business and political influence. Joseph combined education, finance, marriage, and calculated risk to move beyond Boston. The dynasty was not inherited from an ancient house. It was constructed through institutions that Irish immigrants had first been forced to enter from the margins. Joseph Kennedy had acquired the money and connections to approach America's ruling circles. What he had not yet acquired was the judgment, or the public trust, to lead them. On June 30, 1934, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt named Joseph Kennedy to the inaugural United States Securities and Exchange Commission. 2 days later, the commissioners elected him their first chairman. After a market collapse that exposed manipulation and fraud, Roosevelt had placed a former Wall Street speculator in charge of regulating Wall Street. Kennedy understood the methods the new agency was expected to control. The appointment demonstrated that Kennedy could convert wealth and political support into national authority. It also revealed genuine administrative ability. He recruited capable lawyers and economists, encouraged companies to register under the new securities laws, and established the commission as a regulator that business could not simply ignore. His objective was not to destroy financial markets, but to restore confidence by making them more transparent. When he resigned in September 1935, the new institution had acquired credibility. Roosevelt next appointed Kennedy to the United States Maritime Commission, where he worked on the declining condition of American merchant shipping. Kennedy was no longer merely a wealthy campaign supporter. National political possibilities seemed open, yet his progress depended on Roosevelt, whose confidence could not be purchased or inherited. The Kennedy household was being organized with equal purpose. Joseph and Rose raised 9 children in homes shaped by religion, competition, current events, and expectations of public achievement. Rose kept detailed records of their health and development. Joseph encouraged political discussion and measured success aggressively. The children enjoyed unusual education, travel, and access, but the family culture left limited space for weakness. Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr., the eldest son, was increasingly treated as the likely political heir. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the second son, was intelligent and ambitious but repeatedly ill. In February 1938, Roosevelt appointed Joseph ambassador to Great Britain. For an Irish-American Catholic family once excluded from Boston's Protestant establishment, residence at the court of St. James's represented an extraordinary arrival. Joseph had business and regulatory experience, but no diplomatic background. He entered the post as Nazi Germany threatened the European order, and many Americans feared another world war. Kennedy supported efforts to avoid war and believed Britain was militarily and economically unprepared to defeat Germany. Appeasement was not his policy alone, and the memory of World War I made caution politically understandable. But even as British policy changed, Kennedy remained convinced that resistance could end in disaster. After war began in September 1939, his predictions of British defeat and his public commitment to American neutrality placed him increasingly at odds with the British government and the Roosevelt administration. The problem was not simply that Kennedy feared war. He underestimated Britain's capacity to resist, treated negotiation with Adolf Hitler as a practical necessity after the character of the Nazi regime had become unmistakable, and spoke publicly in ways that weakened the position he was supposed to represent. Accounts from the period and later archival research also document anti-Semitic comments and conspiracy claims that distorted his interpretation of the crisis. In 1940, as German aircraft attacked Britain, Kennedy suggested in a newspaper interview that democracy in Britain was effectively finished, and that the conflict was being fought for national survival rather than democratic principle. The interview destroyed what remained of his diplomatic standing. Kennedy returned to the United States and resigned in November 1940. He had correctly recognized the destructive scale of another European war, but his defeatism, prejudices, and political misjudgment closed the path toward the national leadership he desired. Money had carried him into the highest circles of government. It could not make his judgment trusted within them. Control inside the family now became even more consequential. Rosemary Kennedy, the eldest daughter, had intellectual disabilities and required assistance that changed as she entered adulthood. In 1941, after doctors argued that an experimental lobotomy might control her increasingly difficult behavior, Joseph authorized the procedure without informing Rose or the other children beforehand. The operation left Rosemary unable to walk or speak normally and dependent on institutional care. The decision reflected the limited medical understanding of the period, but it also exposed Joseph's willingness to make an irreversible choice alone. The extent of Rosemary's condition was then kept from much of the family and the public. As Joseph's own political future receded, expectations concentrated on Joseph Jr. He served as a naval aviator during World War II and volunteered for another dangerous assignment after completing enough missions to return home. On August 12, 1944, he and fellow pilot Wilford John Willey took off from England in an explosives-filled bomber for Project Anvil. The aircraft was intended to become radio-controlled after the pilots armed it and bailed out. It detonated before they could escape, killing both men. That same year, Kathleen Kennedy Cavendish married William Cavendish, the Marquess of Hartington, despite religious conflict between their families. He was killed in combat 4 months later. On May 13, 1948, Kathleen died in an airplane crash in France. Joseph attended her burial, confronting another loss that wealth and influence could not prevent. Joseph Kennedy's own road to the presidency had closed, and the son chosen to continue it was dead. The family's political future now rested on the brother who had never been raised as its first heir. On April 25, 1946, John Fitzgerald Kennedy entered the crowded Democratic contest for Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District. Covering working-class neighborhoods in Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville, it attracted several experienced opponents. Kennedy was 28, thin from illness, and new to electoral politics. He was also a decorated veteran with a famous name, a wealthy father, and a family prepared to treat the campaign as a collective undertaking. His wartime record gave that campaign a foundation money could not manufacture. On August 2, 1943, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri struck patrol torpedo boat 109 in the Solomon Islands. 2 crewmen died. Kennedy gathered the survivors and helped them reach an island, towing the badly burned Patrick McMahon by holding a life jacket strap between his teeth. The men were rescued after several days. Joseph Kennedy later publicized the episode nationally, but the promotion amplified documented courage rather than inventing it. The healthy young hero presented to voters concealed another reality. Kennedy suffered chronic back pain and was diagnosed with Addison's disease, a dangerous failure of the adrenal glands. His family and physicians kept the diagnosis from the public while treatment allowed him to continue. The contrast between physical vulnerability and projected vigor would remain central to his political image. Joseph financed and advised the congressional campaign, while Rose Kennedy and her daughters hosted receptions and contacted voters. Yet John had to become a candidate in his own right. He visited factories, union halls, veterans groups, and private homes, gradually improving a speaking style that initially seemed hurried and formal. He won the crowded primary, then the general election, and served 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives. In 1952, Kennedy challenged Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Robert Francis Kennedy managed an intense statewide organization. Rose and the Kennedy sisters hosted teas that reached thousands of women outside traditional party meetings. John traveled constantly and adapted his message to local concerns. He defeated Lodge, even as Dwight David Eisenhower carried Massachusetts in the presidential election. Family resources mattered, but the ability to attract voters beyond the Democratic organization made the victory possible. Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier in September 1953. Her education, interest in history, and command of languages added cultural sophistication to the public partnership. Soon afterward, Kennedy underwent dangerous operations for his deteriorating back. During his recovery, he developed profiles in courage, studies of senators who had accepted political risk for principle. Theodore Sorensen conducted extensive research and prepared important drafts. Kennedy directed the project, revised the material, and accepted authorship. The precise division of labor later became controversial, but describing Sorensen as merely incidental would be misleading. The book won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1957 and strengthened Kennedy's national reputation. At the Democratic National Convention in 1956, Kennedy nearly won the vice presidential nomination before losing to Estes Kefauver. The defeat spared him from sharing the Democratic ticket's heavy loss, while the televised convention introduced him nationally. Over the next 4 years, he traveled, built alliances, improved his delivery, and prepared for the presidency. When Kennedy declared his candidacy in January 1960, his Catholic faith remained a major obstacle. His victory over Hubert Humphrey in Wisconsin depended heavily on Catholic districts and failed to settle the issue. West Virginia, where Catholics formed only a small part of the electorate, offered a clearer test. Kennedy confronted religious prejudice directly, campaigned intensively, and won. In September, addressing the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, he affirmed that presidential decisions would be governed by the Constitution and national interest rather than instructions from church authorities. Robert managed a national operation that combined family money, local organizers, polling, rapid travel, and close control of scheduling. Kennedy also benefited from selecting Lyndon Baines Johnson as his running mate, from strong Catholic turnout, and from growing support among black voters. His campaign's intervention after the arrest of Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrated a responsiveness that the Republican campaign failed to match. The 4 televised debates against Vice President Richard Nixon did not decide the election alone. They allowed Kennedy to appear informed, composed, and presidential before an enormous audience, weakening the argument that he was too young or inexperienced. Nixon's illness, exhausting schedule, and promise to campaign in every state limited his effectiveness, while Kennedy concentrated more efficiently on competitive states. On November 8th, Kennedy won by fewer than 120,000 popular votes out of almost 69 million cast. Allegations of fraud centered on Illinois and Texas, where political machines and documented irregularities gave suspicion plausible foundations. Later investigations and historical studies have not established enough fraudulent votes to reverse the national result. Changing Illinois alone would not have eliminated Kennedy's Electoral College majority. Money, organization, television, religion, and opposition mistakes all mattered. None explains the victory by itself. Kennedy supplied endurance, adaptability, political judgment, and an ability to connect with voters that the family machine could support but not create. That machine had delivered what Joseph Kennedy could not win for himself. In the White House, campaign discipline would be tested by nuclear danger, civil rights, secrecy, and the limits of family loyalty. On January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy became the first Roman Catholic president of the United States. The victory completed a three-generation rise from immigrant Boston to the White House. It also carried the family method into government. Kennedy appointed his 35-year-old brother, Robert Francis Kennedy, as Attorney General. Robert had experience as a Senate investigator and campaign manager, but critics saw nepotism. To the president, he offered advice secured by personal loyalty. Jacqueline Kennedy shaped the administration's public identity. She restored historic furnishings to the White House, promoted American arts, and used her knowledge of languages and culture during foreign visits. Her televised tour of the executive mansion reached a vast audience. Images of the young couple and their children projected intelligence, elegance, and national renewal. The limits of confidence appeared quickly. In April 1961, Kennedy approved a plan inherited from the previous administration to land Cuban exiles trained by the Central Intelligence Agency at the Bay of Pigs. Planners expected the invasion to encourage an uprising against Fidel Castro, but Cuban forces defeated it within 3 days and captured more than 1,000 exiles. Kennedy accepted public responsibility and broadened his advisory process, yet failure did not end the effort to remove Castro. Operation Mongoose authorized sabotage, propaganda, and covert action, with Robert playing a central supervisory role. American agencies also explored assassination plots. Surviving evidence does not prove that the president approved every scheme, but his administration sustained the campaign in which they developed. Cold War pressure extended beyond Cuba. A difficult meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was followed by construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961. Kennedy reinforced the American commitment to West Berlin without attempting to destroy the barrier by force. Then, in October 1962, photographs revealed Soviet nuclear missiles under construction in Cuba. For 13 days, Kennedy considered airstrikes, invasion, diplomacy, and a naval quarantine. Unlike at the Bay of Pigs, he encouraged sustained disagreement and resisted demands for immediate attack. The public settlement removed Soviet missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. Secretly, Robert told Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin that obsolete American Jupiter missiles in Turkey would also be withdrawn, provided the arrangement remained outside the public agreement. Kennedy helped prevent escalation, but the settlement was a negotiated compromise rather than the unconditional victory later mythology sometimes suggested. The crisis encouraged movement toward arms control. In 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, though not underground. Kennedy also established the Peace Corps and committed the country to landing an astronaut on the Moon before the decade ended. These initiatives joined Cold War competition with public service, science, and national purpose. Vietnam followed a less controlled trajectory. Kennedy increased American military advisors in South Vietnam from under 1,000 to more than 16,000 and expanded equipment, aviation, and counterinsurgency assistance. His administration pressed President Ngo Dinh Diem for reforms, then maintained contact with generals planning a coup. Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu were killed after the government fell in November 1963. Kennedy did not order their deaths, but American policy helped create the conditions for the coup. Plans for a limited advisor withdrawal existed, yet surviving evidence cannot establish what Kennedy would have done as the war intensified. At home, Kennedy initially approached civil rights cautiously, concerned about Southern Democrats and resistance from white voters. Movement activists repeatedly forced the issue into federal view. Roberts' Justice Department protected freedom riders, confronted segregation at universities, and intensified prosecutions of organized crime. In 1962, federal marshals and troops enabled James Meredith to enroll at the University of Mississippi despite violent opposition. By the summer of 1963, televised brutality in Birmingham and continuing demonstrations made incremental action increasingly untenable. On June 11th, after federal intervention integrated the University of Alabama, Kennedy described civil rights as a national moral issue and proposed legislation against segregation in public accommodations. It was a substantial change, but one produced partly by activists who had accepted risks the administration initially sought to contain. A darker contradiction followed in October. Acting on warnings from Federal Bureau of Investigation Director John Edgar Hoover about one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s advisors, Robert authorized wiretaps on King's home and the offices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The surveillance did not establish that King was controlled by communists, but the Bureau expanded its campaign against him. Secrecy that protected sensitive diplomacy could also shelter abuses from scrutiny. The same discipline protected the president's image. Kennedy received continuing treatment for Addison's disease and severe back pain while the public saw vigor. Multiple extramarital relationships, documented through later testimony and records, remained concealed. Jacqueline's cultural work and the administration's achievements were real, but so was the machinery separating public presentation from private conduct. By November 1963, the administration had moved from the Bay of Pigs toward a test ban treaty and a major civil rights bill. Its record contained learning, courage, delay, covert violence, and unresolved commitments. A rifle in Dallas would end that evolution and transform a disputed presidency into a national legend. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon on November 22, 1963, the presidential motorcade entered Dealey Plaza in Dallas. Gunfire struck President John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally. Jacqueline Kennedy remained beside her husband as the limousine raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Doctors pronounced the president dead at 1 o'clock. At 2:38 that afternoon, Lyndon Baines Johnson took the presidential oath aboard Air Force One at Love Field. Jacqueline stood beside him in the suit she had worn during the shooting. The aircraft then carried Kennedy's body to Washington. Police traced the shooting to the Texas School Book Depository, where Lee Harvey Oswald worked. A rifle and 3 cartridge cases were found near a 6th-floor window. Purchase records, photographs, fingerprints, and ballistic evidence connected Oswald to the weapon. After leaving the building, he was confronted by Dallas police officer Tippit, who was shot and killed. Witnesses identified Oswald, who was arrested inside a movie theater carrying a revolver. He denied killing either man and was never brought to trial. On November 24th, nightclub owner Jack Ruby entered the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters as officers prepared to transfer Oswald. Ruby stepped forward and shot him in front of television cameras. Oswald died at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The killing ensured that Oswald would never testify in court, and it gave suspicion a permanent opening. Kennedy's funeral on November 25th combined Catholic ritual with military ceremony. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where Jacqueline lit an eternal flame. 4 days later, Jacqueline spoke with journalist Theodore White and connected her husband's presidency to the musical Camelot. Published by Life magazine, the comparison framed the administration as a brilliant, vanished moment. Camelot was not a neutral description of Kennedy's government. It was a memorial interpretation created after his death. President Johnson established the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Supported by a Federal Bureau of Investigation inquiry involving approximately 25,000 interviews, the commission concluded in 1964 that Oswald fired 3 shots from the depository and acted alone. It found that 1 bullet passed through Kennedy and wounded Connally, while another caused the fatal head injury. It also found no evidence that Ruby belonged to a conspiracy. The conclusion rested on substantial evidence, but the process had weaknesses. Oswald's death prevented a trial with adversarial testing of the case. The Central Intelligence Agency and Federal Bureau of Investigation did not fully disclose their knowledge of anti-Castro operations, assassination schemes against Fidel Castro, or all relevant intelligence concerning Oswald. Those omissions did not prove that either agency killed Kennedy. They did demonstrate that investigators were evaluating a fragmented record supplied by institutions protecting their own secrets. Congress reopened the case through the House Select Committee on Assassinations. In 1979, it agreed that Oswald fired the shots that struck Kennedy, but concluded there was a high probability that a second gunman had fired from the grassy knoll and missed. On that basis, it described the assassination as probably resulting from a conspiracy. The committee could not identify the additional gunman, determine the conspiracy's extent, or establish involvement by the Soviet government, Cuba, organized crime, anti-Castro groups, or American intelligence agencies. The second gunman finding depended heavily on analysis of a Dallas police audio recording. A later review by the National Academy of Sciences found serious timing and identification problems. Its 1982 report concluded that the evidence against the supposed grassy knoll gunshot was strong. Once the acoustic foundation was removed, the committee's probable conspiracy conclusion no longer possessed its principal scientific support. Public distrust nevertheless continued. Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union, returned to the United States, supported Fidel Castro, and visited Soviet and Cuban diplomatic offices in Mexico City shortly before the assassination. Government agencies had information about parts of this history, yet communicated poorly and withheld records for decades. A crime captured on film, followed by the televised murder of its accused gunman, seemed larger than the explanation offered. In 1992, Congress passed the President John Fitzgerald Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, creating an independent review board and a presumption that assassination records should be disclosed. Millions of pages were eventually assembled at the National Archives. Releases continued across several administrations as disputed redactions and postponements gradually narrowed. On March 18, 2025, the National Archives released more than 80,000 pages of previously classified material. The documents provided greater detail about intelligence operations, surveillance methods, Cuba, Mexico, and the scale of Cold War secrecy. Early assessments by historians found no verified evidence overturning the central conclusion that Oswald fired the shots from the depository. The files expanded understanding of why intelligence agencies guarded information, but they did not establish an alternative assassin or proven conspiracy. The strongest conclusion is therefore narrower than either certainty or endless mystery. Evidence strongly connects Oswald to the rifle and the sixth-floor firing position. No reliable evidence has yet identified a second shooter or organization directing him. Suspicion survives because institutions concealed relevant activities, early investigations had limits, and the accused was silenced before trial. Dallas did not merely remove a president, it turned his unfinished record into a standard no successor could fully possess. Robert Kennedy now had to decide whether to preserve that memory or build a political identity of his own. On November 3, 1964, Robert Francis Kennedy won election to the United States Senate from New York, defeating Republican Senator Kenneth Keating. For the first time, the former Attorney General from Massachusetts possessed elected authority that did not come from John Kennedy's presidency. The victory did not free him from Dallas. Kennedy remained Attorney General under Lyndon Baines Johnson, but distrust, grief, and rivalry burdened their relationship. Lacking executive power in the Senate, he turned to hearings, travel, and public advocacy. Ethel Kennedy campaigned beside him while raising their growing family. Kennedy's political development was real, but it did not erase his past. As Attorney General, he had been a cold warrior, supervised covert action against Cuba, and authorized surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. He had also enforced desegregation orders and pursued organized crime. As a senator, encounters beyond Washington broadened his priorities. In 1967, Kennedy traveled through the Mississippi Delta after hearings exposed failures in federal food programs. He entered homes where children showed signs of severe malnutrition and pressed the administration to respond. In New York, he supported a community development corporation intended to bring residents, government, and private investment together in Bedford-Stuyvesant. These efforts did not end poverty, but they moved him toward experiments in local economic power. His international language also changed. At the University of Cape Town in June 1966, Kennedy condemned apartheid and argued that individual acts of courage could create widening ripples of resistance. The address connected racial rule abroad with the unfinished struggle for equality in the United States and strengthened his appeal to younger voters. Vietnam produced the most difficult transformation. Kennedy had participated in an administration that expanded American involvement, and he initially supported Johnson while urging negotiation and reform in South Vietnam. As troop levels and casualties increased, he criticized bombing, questioned escalation, and called for a political settlement that included the enemy. His opposition therefore carried an admission, sometimes incomplete, that policies inherited from his brother's administration had helped create the war he now challenged. Senator Eugene McCarthy entered the Democratic presidential contest first and performed unexpectedly well against Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. Robert announced his candidacy on March 16, 1968. Critics accused him of exploiting McCarthy's success. Yet Kennedy offered a broader campaign, combining opposition to the war with poverty, racial justice, urban decline, and distrust of established power. Johnson withdrew at the end of March, while Vice President Hubert Horatio Humphrey later entered with strong support from party leaders. On April 4th, Kennedy arrived in Indianapolis after learning that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis. Speaking to a largely black audience that had not heard the news, he announced King's death, acknowledged the murder of his own brother, and appealed against collective hatred. Indianapolis avoided the large-scale unrest that struck many other cities, although no single speech can fully explain why. Kennedy won primaries in Indiana, Nebraska, South Dakota, and California, while losing in Oregon. His crowds included Black and Latino voters, students, labor households, and working-class white communities drawn to social reform and his warnings about disorder. The coalition was impressive but unstable. Most convention delegates were still selected through party organizations rather than primaries, and Humphrey held substantial institutional support. Even after California, Kennedy had not secured the nomination. Shortly after midnight on June 5th, Kennedy addressed supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles and celebrated his California victory. As he passed through a crowded kitchen pantry, Sirhan Bishara Sirhan opened fire with a revolver. Kennedy and 5 others were wounded. Bystanders seized Sirhan at the scene while he still held the weapon. Kennedy died on June 6th. Ethel was at the hospital, pregnant with their 11th child. Sirhan, a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant, had written repeatedly about killing Kennedy. His notebooks and later statements connected his hostility to Kennedy's support for Israel, and the shooting occurred on the first anniversary of the Six-Day War. A jury convicted him of first-degree murder in 1969. His death sentence was later changed to life imprisonment after California invalidated its death penalty system. Disputes developed around the physical evidence. The autopsy indicated that the fatal shot entered from behind at close range, while witnesses generally placed Sirhan in front of Kennedy. Critics also challenged bullet comparisons and claimed that an audio recording contained more shots than Sirhan's 8-round weapon could hold. These questions prompted calls for renewed investigation from some Kennedy relatives and Paul Schrey, who was wounded in the pantry. No court or official inquiry, however, has identified a second gunman or overturned Sirhan's conviction. In 2025, more than 10,000 pages of federal records were released, followed by additional files. They included witness interviews, investigative reports, and Sirhan's handwritten notes. The material added detail about the investigation and his documented fixation, but produced no verified finding that displaced the conviction or established another shooter. Robert Kennedy had changed from a family enforcer into a candidate capable of joining constituencies rarely comfortable in the same coalition. Whether he could have won the nomination or defeated the Republican candidate remains unknowable. His death ended the family's second attempt to reclaim the White House before voters could deliver a verdict. At 36, Edward Kennedy inherited the name, the dependence, and expectations that had already consumed two brothers. On June 8, 1968, Edward Moore Kennedy delivered the eulogy for Robert Kennedy at St. Patrick's Cathedral. He was 36. Joseph Kennedy's stroke in 1961 had left the patriarch unable to direct the family, and three older brothers were dead. Edward carried responsibility for its dependence and a political inheritance that had already consumed two presidential heirs. He possessed more than a famous name. Elected to the Senate in 1962, Kennedy had worked on civil rights, immigration, health care, and education. Early in 1969, his Democratic colleagues chose him as Majority Whip. Joan Kennedy, a pianist and mother of their three children, had campaigned for him. Yet public unity concealed strain within their marriage. Then came an event in which tragedy could not be separated from Edward's decisions. On July 18, 1969, Kennedy attended a gathering on Chappaquiddick Island near Martha's Vineyard. Several guests had worked for Robert's presidential campaign as the Boiler Room Girls, tracking delegates. Mary Jo Kopechne was one of them. 28 years old, she had earned a business degree, taught at a Catholic school in Montgomery, Alabama, and worked for Senator George Smathers before joining Robert Kennedy's staff. During the presidential campaign, she monitored delegate commitments and relayed political information. After Robert's death, she entered political consulting. She had a career of her own, not merely a place in another Kennedy scandal. Late that night, Kopechne left the gathering in a car driven by Edward Kennedy. Instead of reaching the ferry landing, the car traveled along Dyke Road and fell from Dyke Bridge into Poucha Pond. Kennedy escaped. He later said that he repeatedly tried to rescue Kopechne, then returned to the cottage and sought help from his cousin Joseph Gargan and attorney Paul Markham. What is certain is that none of the three men immediately called the police. Kennedy returned to Edgartown and did not report the crash until the following morning. By then, the submerged car had been discovered and a diver had recovered Kopechne's body. Whatever fear, shock, calculation, or confusion shaped those hours cannot be established from surviving evidence. Kennedy's failure to summon authorities promptly can. The absence of an autopsy left additional questions. Her death certificate recorded drowning, while the diver believed that an air pocket might have allowed her to survive for a time. Other experts disputed that assessment, and a Pennsylvania court refused to permit exhumation. The precise time of death, and whether an earlier alarm could have saved her, remain unresolved. On July 25, Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident after causing personal injury. The judge imposed a 2-month jail sentence and suspended it. That evening, Kennedy addressed the nation and asked Massachusetts voters whether he should remain in office. Their response allowed him to continue, but his address did not resolve the contradictions in his account. A judicial inquest convened in January 1970. Judge James Boyle found probable cause to believe Kennedy had operated the car negligently and that his driving appeared to have contributed to Kopechne's death. He also rejected important elements of Kennedy's explanation for reaching the bridge. No additional charge followed, and a grand jury returned no indictment. The proceedings established responsibility for leaving the scene, not a complete reconstruction of the night. claims that family influence dictated every official decision cannot be proved. Yet Kennedy possessed lawyers, advisors, media access, and political loyalty unavailable to most defendants. His name helped him survive, but it could not erase the perception that privilege had limited the consequences. Massachusetts voters returned Kennedy to the Senate in 1970, although he soon lost his position as Majority Whip. He declined presidential campaigns in 1972 and 1976 for several stated reasons, but Chappaquiddick remained an obstacle. He rebuilt authority through committee work on health care, labor, refugees, and judicial appointments. The White House receded while his legislative power grew. By 1979, President Jimmy Carter faced inflation, energy shortages, and Democratic discontent. Kennedy announced his presidential campaign on November 7th. 3 days earlier, an interview with Roger Mudd had exposed a weakness. Asked why he wanted the presidency, Kennedy gave a long answer without a clear governing purpose. Chappaquiddick also returned, testing public trust in his judgment. Although separated from Edward since 1978, Joan appeared during the campaign, preserving a public alliance despite their private division. Carter defeated Kennedy in the early contests, aided by presidential organization and national unity during the Iran hostage crisis. Kennedy recovered to win primaries, including New York and California, but never overcame Carter's delegate lead. At the Democratic National Convention in August, he conceded and delivered a forceful defense of economic liberalism. The speech restored stature, not the nomination. Chappaquiddick had not ended Edward Kennedy's public life. Family loyalty, Massachusetts support, and legislative ability gave him a second career lasting decades. But the Kennedy name could protect a Senate seat more readily than it could restore presidential trust. Mary Jo Kopechne's death remained the boundary between misfortune imposed upon the family and tragedy intensified by one brother's choices. Chappaquiddick broke the assumption that the Kennedy name could carry another brother into the presidency. Yet as political power changed form, new deaths across the next generations encouraged Americans to replace complicated history with a simpler explanation: a family curse. On April 25, 1984, David Anthony Kennedy was found dead in a Palm Beach hotel room, nearly 16 years after the assassination of his father, Robert Kennedy. He was 28. An autopsy found that a combination of cocaine, the painkiller meperidine, and the antipsychotic drug thioridazine caused the fatal overdose. David had struggled with substance dependence for years. His death was devastating, but its medical cause was neither hidden nor mysterious. The language of a Kennedy curse nevertheless made separate tragedies appear connected. Edward Kennedy had publicly wondered about such a curse after Chappaquiddick. The phrase offered an emotional pattern: a celebrated family repeatedly raised toward power and repeatedly struck down. As history, however, a pattern requires more than a sequence. It requires evidence that the events share a cause. Michael Lemoyne Kennedy, another son of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, died in Aspen, Colorado on December 31, 1997. He was 39 and was playing football while skiing when he struck a tree. The death was ruled accidental. It involved a dangerous recreational activity, not the mechanism that had killed David or their father. The most nationally consuming loss came on July 16, 1999. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr. was piloting a single-engine airplane from New Jersey toward Martha's Vineyard. His wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bessette, were passengers. The aircraft descended into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all three. The official investigation supplied a technical rather than supernatural explanation. The National Transportation Safety Board found no evidence of mechanical failure. Its probable cause determination identified John's failure to maintain control during a descent over water at night as the result of spatial disorientation. Haze and darkness contributed. John was licensed to fly under visual conditions, but had not obtained an instrument rating. Over dark water, the loss of a visible horizon can make bodily sensations conflict with the aircraft's instruments. That finding did not reduce the grief. John had grown from the small child seen saluting his father's coffin into a lawyer and magazine publisher pursued by cameras. Carolyn had built a career in fashion before their marriage, while Lauren worked in finance. Yet coverage repeatedly absorbed both sisters into the Kennedy narrative. Carolyn, a Kennedy by marriage, and Lauren, who was not a Kennedy, became supporting figures in a story described as another family tragedy. 2 decades later, the same framework returned. On August 1st, 2019, 22-year-old Cyrsa Kennedy Hill was found unresponsive at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. She was the daughter of Courtney Kennedy Hill and a granddaughter of Robert Kennedy. Her death certificate identified an accidental overdose involving methadone and alcohol in combination with other medications. Like David's death, hers belonged to the history of substance use and mental health, not to an unexplained force. On April 2, 2020, Maeve Kennedy Townsend McKean and her 8-year-old son, Gideon Joseph Kennedy McKean, entered Chesapeake Bay in a canoe while trying to retrieve a ball. Strong winds carried them away from shore. Maeve was an attorney, public health specialist, and former government official, as well as Robert Kennedy's granddaughter. Their bodies were recovered on separate days, and both deaths were ruled accidental drownings. The same label of curse now covered a boating emergency involving a mother and child. In 2025, the family confronted a different kind of loss. Tatiana Schlossberg, an environmental journalist and daughter of Caroline Kennedy, disclosed that doctors had diagnosed acute myeloid leukemia after the birth of her second child in May 2024. She described the disease and its rare mutation in a personal essay published that November. She died on December 30, 2025, at 35. Cancer did not supply evidence connecting her death to an assassination, overdose, skiing accident, aviation failure, or drowning. Placed in chronological order, these deaths create emotional accumulation. Placed under historical examination, they separate. Political murder involves distinct perpetrators and circumstances. Military death belongs to war. Substance overdoses involve drugs, health, and circumstances specific to each person. The skiing and aviation deaths involved identifiable risks. The drownings resulted from conditions on the water. Leukemia was a disease. No verified evidence unites them through one biological, criminal, or environmental mechanism. The curse narrative survives because the Kennedys form a large extended family whose experiences have been documented for generations. Fame changes the sample presented to the public. A comparable death in an unknown family may remain local. A Kennedy death renews a national archive of earlier losses. Repetition in coverage then makes selected events appear closer and more causally connected than they are. The label also carries an ethical cost. It can replace responsibility with fate when a person's decisions contributed to danger. It can turn addiction or illness into inherited destiny. It can also push people outside the bloodline toward the edge of the story. Mary Jo Kopechne, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, Lauren Bessette, and others had lives that should not be reduced to evidence that misfortune followed one famous name. The losses were real, but the curse was an explanation imposed after the fact. To understand what survived them, the Kennedy legacy must be measured by the institutions, laws, public service, controversies, and divisions that outlived the family machine. On July 20, 1968, only weeks after Robert Kennedy's assassination, Eunice Kennedy Shriver helped open the first International Special Olympics Summer Games at Soldier Field in Chicago. Nearly 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities competed. The contradiction was profound. A family that had concealed Rosemary Kennedy's disability had also produced a woman determined to bring people like her sister out of isolation and into public life. Eunice had begun Camp Shriver in 1962 and used the Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. Foundation to expand recreation and public acceptance. Special Olympics became an international movement, not merely a memorial to Kennedy grief. It demonstrated the most durable form of the family's influence. private wealth and public access converted into an institution capable of surviving its founder. Edward Kennedy made the same transition through legislation. During almost 47 years in the United States Senate, he authored more than 2,500 bills, several hundred of which became law. His work touched civil rights, immigration, education, labor, disability rights, and health care. He learned to negotiate with ideological opponents and accumulated influence through committee mastery rather than presidential glamour. Chappaquiddick remained part of his record, but it did not erase laws that continued to shape lives. Legislative achievement, like personal responsibility, survives selective memory. Other family members carried influence into different institutions. Jean Kennedy Smith founded Very Special Arts, which expanded access to arts education for people with disabilities. As United States Ambassador to Ireland, she participated in the diplomacy surrounding the Northern Ireland peace process. Ethel Kennedy raised 11 children after Robert's murder and helped create the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Human Rights Center, extending his legacy through advocacy. Caroline Kennedy served as United States Ambassador to Japan and later to Australia. In the next generation, Joseph Patrick Kennedy II served 6 terms in the House of Representatives and led Citizens Energy. Patrick Joseph Kennedy represented Rhode Island and became a prominent advocate for mental health policy. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend served as Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Joseph Patrick Kennedy III represented Massachusetts for 4 terms. These careers shared a family vocabulary of service, but not one command structure or political program. The old electoral succession was already weakening. In 2020, Joseph Kennedy III challenged Senator Edward Markey in the Massachusetts Democratic primary and lost. When his House term ended in January 2021, Congress contained no Kennedy for the first time in decades. The name still attracted money, attention, and expectations, but voters no longer treated inheritance as a sufficient qualification. A different branch then demonstrated how far the family had divided. Robert Francis Kennedy Jr. became Secretary of the United States Department of Health and Human Services in February 2025. By July 2026, he remained in that office. Yet his political alliances and public health positions produced open opposition from several close relatives, some of whom called for his resignation. His cabinet authority was substantial, but it represented an individual career, not the return of a unified Kennedy platform. John Kennedy's grandson, Jack Schlossberg, attempted another route back to elected office. In June 2026, he lost the Democratic primary for New York's 12th congressional district to Micah Lasher. The defeat, following Joseph Kennedy's loss in Massachusetts, showed that national recognition could open a campaign but could no longer deliver victory by itself. What, then, made the Kennedys historically important after the family machine dispersed? Their rise had depended on accumulated wealth, political networks, education, disciplined organization, media skill, and an intense obligation to advance the family. Those forces placed John Kennedy in the White House and Robert beside him. Between 1960 and 1968, family power achieved its greatest concentration. Assassination then removed 2 leaders, while scandal and changing politics prevented a 3rd presidential succession. Afterward, Kennedy power did not disappear. It fragmented. Some entered statutes, some entered diplomacy, disability advocacy, human rights organizations, public health debates, and cultural memory. That diffusion explains why the family remained visible without a single presidential heir. It also prevents a clean, heroic conclusion. The record includes civil rights enforcement and delayed action, nuclear diplomacy and covert operations, social legislation and surveillance, public service and private concealment. Wealth created opportunity, but it also created insulation from consequences unavailable to ordinary Americans. The assassinations of John and Robert Kennedy were acts of political violence, not evidence of supernatural punishment. The family's other deaths arose from war, disease, substance use, risk, and accidents. Calling all of them a curse simplifies grief while obscuring causes. Calling the entire legacy Camelot performs a similar distortion, replacing disputed decisions and unfinished policies with a brief image of lost promise. The story therefore returns to Dealey Plaza. When John Kennedy was shot there, the gunfire ended a presidency, but did not create the Kennedy dynasty. It transformed an incomplete administration into a symbol, and taught Americans to interpret the family through loss. Yet, the history began before Dallas in immigrant neighborhoods, political wards, banks, campaigns, and family ambition. It continued afterward in legislatures, embassies, charities, courtrooms, hospitals, scandals, and elections. The Kennedys no longer govern American political life as a unified dynasty. What they left is more complicated and more durable: laws, institutions, public service, cultural memory, unresolved controversies, and a continuing argument about whether great privilege can ever be balanced by great responsibility.